From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana Siddiqui. We begin with the international news first. The Taliban could overrun Afghanistan's capital Kabul within 90 days. That's according to a Washington Post report citing a U.S. intelligence assessment. The Taliban seized the strategic Afghan city of Ghazni on Thursday, which is just 95 miles from Kabul. It is one of the Taliban's most important gains. They have also seized 10 provincial capitals in a week. The Afghan government has now effectively lost most of northern and western Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands of Afghans have been displaced by the fighting that has enveloped the country. They have fled to Kabul, sparking a new humanitarian crisis in the already overtaxed capital. In this clip, Afghan government soldiers are seen surrendering to the Taliban in Kunduz. Meanwhile, the Taliban on Wednesday denied targeting and killing civilians during an offensive against Afghan government troops. Their statement came after the United Nations said more than 1,000 civilians had been killed in the past month. The Taliban proposed that a team made up of the UN and other aid groups accompany their representatives. This would be to conduct an impartial and independent investigation into the latest events. In related news, concerns for Afghan women are rising as the conflict between Afghanistan's government and the Taliban increases. Here is Fawzia Kufi, a member of the Afghan negotiating team in talks with the Taliban.
As the situation becomes more military than it is now, it is between the main fighters from one side, fighters from the other side. And in between, it's the women of this country and the children of this country which will be the most defenseless, and they will be affected.
Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani flew to the besieged northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif Wednesday to rally his beleaguered forces. The Taliban are asking for President Ghani to resign as a condition for a ceasefire and to restart peace negotiations. Work is not easy for women anywhere. Governor Salima Mazari is fighting to keep the Taliban out of her district. More details in this report by Ali Khalaf and Saleha Farouk.
It is hard to work as a district governor in Afghanistan under normal circumstances. It is worse while there is an armed conflict. It is even more difficult for women governors. But Salima Mazari is no ordinary woman. She is one of only 3 female district governors in Afghanistan. Her work does not end with a day in office. She negotiates with the Taliban to keep farmers safe as she gets people to stand up and defend their area.
When I started my work, it was calm for around 6 months, though there were rumors the Taliban were forcing people to give them money or surrender to them. But when the fight started, it's been 2.5 years that we've been fighting the Taliban.
To keep the Jharkhand people safe, Mazari established a security commission that recruits Afghans into local militias. Most fighters are farmers, shepherds, and laborers. Although half of the district that Mazari runs is already under Taliban control, she has managed to keep the second half as a safe zone for the people that she represents.
We used to be craftsmen and workers till the Taliban, attacked our villages. So we were forced to buy weapons and ammunition to fight against them.
While defending against the Taliban, she fights the corruption in the government as well. She says that her district lacks basic supplies.
The Israeli army on Tuesday razed land near the Ibrahimi Mosque in the occupied West Bank city of Hebron. Sheikh Hifthi Abu Isniya is the imam at the historic site. He told Quds News Network that the Israeli military is implementing its plan to construct a road. This will be used exclusively by illegal Israeli settlers. Local Islamic groups have called for Palestinians to mobilize in defense of the house of worship. The mosque was the site of a massacre by an Israeli settler almost 3 decades ago. On February 25, 1994, Baruch Goldstein murdered 29 Palestinians as they prayed in the mosque during the month of Ramadan. Goldstein also wounded 150 others. Meanwhile, Anadolu news agency is reporting that 81 Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem were destroyed by Israel this year alone. Israeli authorities have recently announced plans to demolish dozens of Palestinian homes in Al-Bustan and Batan al-Hawa neighborhoods in Silwan. International law regards both the West Bank and East Jerusalem as occupied territories. It also considers all Jewish settlement building activity there illegal. Scientists are saying that a blood clot syndrome after the first dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine carries a high risk of death. Researchers in the UK have found that the syndrome is extremely rare. However, it can occur in otherwise young and healthy people. In those aged under 50, blood clots occur in around 1 in 50,000 people who have received the vaccine, data suggests. The AstraZeneca vaccine is currently one of the most widely used COVID vaccines in the world. In light of the initial news about the syndrome a few weeks ago, the UK has been offering people under the age of 40 an alternative vaccine. But the World Health Organization has said that the benefits of administering the vaccine continue to outweigh its risks. A mosque in Hyderabad, India has opened an operation theater where surgeries are being conducted free of charge. Masjid Omar Shifa has been running a primary healthcare center. It is open to all, regardless of religion. The health center is funded by the American Muslim Physicians of Indian origin. The Chicago-based organization was established in 2007. Apart from the full-fledged operation theater, the mosque runs a dental clinic, a community ophthalmology center, and a non-communicable diseases consultation desk. The Mosque Health Center sees about 700 patients daily. Canada is violating international law by selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. That's according to a new report by rights groups Amnesty International Canada and Project Plowshares. They are urging Canada to suspend all arms exports to Saudi Arabia. The two groups found that Canadian weapons transfers to the Gulf Kingdom could be used to commit or facilitate violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. This is particularly the case in Saudi Arabia's ongoing war on neighboring Yemen. In 2020, Canadian weapons exports to Saudi Arabia totaled over $1 billion, according to government figures. That was second only to the U.S. These exports accounted for 67% of Canada's total non-U.S. arms exports. Qatar's Hamad International Airport has been recognized as the world's best airport at this year's Skytrax World Airport Awards. It replaces Singapore's Changi Airport, which has long been at the top of the rankings. The awards are based on voting by airline passengers between August last year and last month. Changi Airport, which slipped to third place in the rankings this year, had held the top spot for almost a decade. Japan's Haneda Airport was in the global second place and won Best Airport in Asia. In domestic news, a federal judge in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday declined to dismiss a lawsuit against 3 supporters of former President Donald Trump. They are his former personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, lawyer Sidney Powell, and MyPillow CEO Mike Lindell. The ruling pertains to 3 defamation lawsuits filed by Dominion Voting Systems. The lawsuit is asking for a judgment of $1.3 billion each against the 3 defendants. This is for allegedly claiming, without evidence, that the voting machine company rigged the 2020 presidential election for President Joe Biden by manipulating votes. U.S. District Judge Carl Nichols is a Trump nominee. The Wednesday order clears the way for the litigation to proceed. In related news, Dominion Voting Systems this week also sued a pair of far-right media companies and the former head of Overstock.com. This is also for defamation based on statements made about the 2020 election. Incoming New York Governor Kathy Hochul says she's ready for the job. Hochul is set to become New York's first female governor after Andrew Cuomo resigned over sexual harassment allegations this week. Hochul will succeed Cuomo as the state's 57th governor. She said she will work to change the toxic work culture in the state's top office. She begins her term in less than 2 weeks.
I spoke with Governor Cuomo yesterday, and he pledged his full support for a smooth transition. And I thanked him for his service to our state. Regarding his decision to step down, I believe it is appropriate and in the best interest of the state of New York. And while it was not expected, it is a day for which I am prepared.
U.S. Republican Senator Ted Cruz successfully led his party's refusal to allow a federal voting rights bill to pass in the Senate yesterday. This was before the Senate recessed for the summer. Senator Cruz blocked what was the last attempt to vote on the For the People Act before recess. Republican opposition is consistent with the more than 400 voter suppression bills filed by state legislators around the country. Anti-voter laws have already been enacted in states with Republican governors such as Florida, Georgia, and Arizona. They are also being actively pursued in Texas. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer announced that voting rights would be the first matter the Senate takes up upon returning to session in September. A coalition of civil rights and faith-based organizations yesterday denounced blatant anti-Muslim hostility targeting one of President Joe Biden's nominees. President Biden nominated Dilawar Sayed for Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Small Business Administration back in March, but it has been unable to move forward with the nomination because of what the coalition has called Senate Republicans' character assassination. They say this has been seen in their anti-Muslim bias and bigotry aimed at stopping Sayed's confirmation. They also said Republican Senate staff are attempting to weaponize his Muslim religion and Pakistani background against him. The coalition includes the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Bend the Arc, and prominent civil rights, Jewish, and faith-based organizations and leaders. In a letter to the Senate Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committee, they called on it to take swift action and vote on Sayed's nomination. If confirmed, Sayed would become the highest-ranking Muslim American in the Biden administration to date. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned and we'll be right back after these messages.
To get inside each other's minds, walk a mile in my shoes, walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
Welcome back. Muslim adults in the U.S. were twice as likely to report a history of suicide attempts compared with individuals from other faiths. This was the finding of a survey by Dr. Rania Awad, who joined Saleha Farouk for a detailed analysis. Let's watch.
Thank you so much and welcome to the program. Today I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Rania Awad, who is a practicing psychiatrist as well as a clinical associate professor based at the Stanford University School of Medicine, as well as the commissioner of this study that we'll discuss today. Dr. Rania, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, this very interesting study about suicide rates by faith was undertaken by the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab. What was the catalyst or need behind this study? We wanted to understand.
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, this is a very difficult topic to study. Mental health in general is very much stigmatized still, and for many communities, especially in Muslim communities, a taboo subject. Suicide I consider to be a discussion that is a taboo within a taboo. In the literature, when we look at who, if there are really findings about Muslims, there's very, very few studies that talk about suicide, and much fewer talking about the population we studied, which was the US or American Muslim population. So we were really filling a research gap to understand what exactly was happening, because anecdotally and clinically in our practices as mental health professionals, we were finding that the rates of suicide was really going up, but we didn't have the scientific evidence and proof to really understand what was really happening. So that was part of the catalyst of the study.
Thank you for that insight. Now, this study has indicated that American Muslims had twice the rate of suicide attempts as members of other faiths, as well as non-faith groups. Understanding, of course, that this is definitely not a black and white issue, what can be analyzed about this situation?
What we can definitely say so far is a very important aspect, which is we studied suicide attempts, which is very different than deaths by suicide or what we call completed suicides. The reason for that is because the literature still shows that Muslims have the lowest rate of death by suicide. But the suicide attempts, which we looked at, was, as you mentioned, twice the number of any other faith group or even non-faith groups, which is very concerning. we're really concerned about a reversing trend potentially. It doesn't necessarily mean that the increased suicide attempts will mean increased death by suicide, but one can definitely lead to the other. And that's the reason we're focusing on this a whole lot more. So that's part of the analysis here, definitely. Another important aspect of our analysis was looking at religiosity. And we, in our measure, we looked specifically at people who were self-identified religiosity, how they themselves identified with levels of religiosity. And we found that it didn't actually make a difference. That's very important because it changes a little bit of the discussion, especially in our communities, where we always talk about how faith alone can protect against suicide. And actually, that is not true, not scientifically, nor is it even in our faith or deen. Actually, there are many measures that one must take for well-being, and only one measure of faith or spirituality alone is not enough. So that's a very important finding as well.
Now, there are numerous similar studies about high mental health challenges and mental health different rates within ethnic as well as racialized minority populations. So would it be okay to understand if there's a link here between mental health challenges and the rate of suicidality in the way that you mentioned, which is the attempt and not necessarily actually going through with it?
It is. I would say that the rates of suicide in general, whether they be attempts or death by suicide, is definitely higher we find in minority or marginalized communities. And part of the reason for that is, as you can probably understand, that if a person feels that they are not part of the very fabric of that society, they're experiencing a lot of different forms of trauma. Perhaps they are even vilified. And for Muslims, we often talk about Islamophobia, and also just other traumatic incidents and aspects in their personal lives, or perhaps in the home countries from which they immigrated from. These are all things that can actually lead to heightened stressors, and heightened stressors does have a correlation with heightened levels of mental health conditions, which also has a heightened level of suicidality as well. So these are important aspects, and they shouldn't be seen individually. They actually need to be seen all together, and in fact, treated and worked on all together.
You also spoke about how suicide response efforts should preferably be tailored to different faith-based populations. Why is this important, and how does it compare to current available resources in this regard?
Absolutely. And this is part of really what I call part of the passion really for me in working in this taboo within a taboo of a subject, is really because I felt in what was available in society at the moment is really either a discussion on suicide from a very scientific, secular, non-faith-based aspect, or if it is addressing faith, it's addressing it from a different faith perspective than the Muslim perspective. And that was there was such a big gap between what Muslims were able to really understand and feel comfortable with. So what I felt was really important in some of the work we undertook at the lab, the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, was actually developing a manual that would address all of the evidence-based, current scientific, cutting-edge research on the topic of suicide, but integrate that fully with the understanding of Islamic ethics, Islamic morals and values, and our belief system, which is really crucial because you have to have the both kind of wedded together in order to really help the community. These are now developed into modules and certificate-based trainings, which we have an entire campaign as part of the nonprofit of the lab called Maristan. Maristan.org is actually where we're going to be doing these trainings that are specific to the Muslim community. We have a 500 imams campaign right now that is focused on training our imams, our religious and community leaders in the Muslim community on specific custom-tailored ways of working with suicide, whether it's at the level of prevention or the level of intervention, if it's happening right there at the moment with somebody that's in the community, or in the unfortunate aftermath of the postvention, which is what we call crisis response. This is very unique because if you look at the Muslim faith, there are aspects of our faith that need to be taken into account, whether it's the funeral prayer, the janazah prayer, the burial rites, the ability to pray on the deceased, and really the grieving of the community. These are all very unique and specific to Muslims. So if you give a very generic kind of suicide training or a generic discussion, it doesn't necessarily really work for our community as well as it could. So that's the work that we do at the lab and now with the nonprofit, the Maristan, to really be able to increase our suicide response efforts in our Muslim communities and make sure that it really is hitting the mark, as we say.
Thank you for that background. Now, you touched upon this a little bit, and maybe it might be worth delving into a little bit more. What might be the various societal factors that might lead people to having mental health challenges that might eventually lead to rates of suicidality, as was analyzed in your report?
So the first thing I should say is that our specific report did not look at those measures. So this is really important. So what I can offer you is really understanding of all the other literature that's in, at the moment, to be able to understand what Muslim stressors are, as opposed to this specific study. So in upcoming studies, we do hope to look deeper into what exactly those issues were. But in general, in the literature, what you find is that with Muslim mental health and their stressors, there's definitely high levels of rates of Islamophobia, and how over 60% of Muslims here in North America say that they have been at the other end of hate crimes, or just dealing with different aspects of Islamophobia. You also find that there is a number of people who have had trauma, whether from their own home countries or their personal lives. There's also issues related to being able to fully feel that they are in a land that they are safe and sound in, and that they are welcomed here. Then there are aspects of mental health that are not specific to culture or faith or religion. They are really just a human condition. We know 1 in 4 people, so that's a good number of us in all communities, not just the Muslim community, are going to have some level of mental health concerns, whether it be a serious mental health condition or a mild or moderate mental health condition. These are all things that are going to happen just biologically or genetically, or what families pass down. So when you look at all of these aspects together, yes, Muslims may have more stressors, just like other people from other marginalized communities, more stressors. But at the same time, there are aspects of mental health that all humans deal with. And I think as a community, as a Muslim community, we need to also come to that understanding and realize that we're not immune to the other conditions that other communities deal with as well.
On a very general level, it can be said that general attitudes towards mental health and getting the right help that one needs might be changing, and more people might be seeing that as more normalized as time goes on. Are these attitudes the same within such marginalized, ethnic minority, racialized, or Muslim communities? Are these viewpoints the same? Is the attitude generally changing and more optimistic?
We have a study actually where we just looked at attitudes and perceptions to mental health in the Muslim community. It was a global study, so we had understanding kind of across the US, North America, but also in other parts of the world. And yes, as you mentioned, there is a shift, and I would say alhamdulillah that there is a shift in looking at mental health in a better light. Definitely we find now that there's some data coming out that I would say the younger population generation who are more recipient to mental health discussions, and also those who have, are willing to try this, what often in our community we feel is kind of a new thing. Mental health being a new thing is not really a new thing. And that's part of the research we do at the lab, as well as a lot of, and the nonprofit Maristan, is a lot of the revival of what our deen, our Islam, has already had in its understanding from the very beginning of Islam, which is mind, body, and soul, really having all aspects of health and wellness in place. And that kind of revival of understanding is leading to the revival of the field called Islamic psychology. It's also leading to the revival of institutions like Maristan, who are really reviving what Muslim civilization had and heritage had for centuries, which is really these healing centers that focused on not just the body, but also the mind and the soul. And I think when you see that kind of revival happening, yes, there is definitely a movement forward, but we still have a very long way to go. I think there's many other members of our Muslim communities and generational gap really in understanding mental health that needs to still be bridged. But I'm hopeful, I'm really hopeful we're starting to move in the right direction, inshallah.
We really wanted to be advantageous about the fact that we are speaking with a psychiatrist here today. If you had any advice or perhaps any resources that you'd like to point out for anyone, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, that might be having certain challenges with their mental health that you could maybe highlight as we conclude today.
Yes, definitely. I would actually like to point to a website that I think has a lot of really great resources. It's a new website, as I mentioned, part of the lab is now our community-facing website. It's Maristan, MARISTAN.org. And if you go to that page and go to /resources, there is a list actually of directories across the US, Canada, and really globally on providers, Muslim mental health providers. We often get this question, how do I find a Muslim mental health practitioner if I feel that myself or my loved one needs some assistance? I also want to mention that since we discussed the topic of suicide today, and I realize that could be a triggering and difficult conversation, here in the US, there is a national 24/7 hotline for a crisis line for the topic of suicide that somebody will definitely pick up and help, that I would like people to know of, and also the same as in Canada. I also would like to say that there are Muslim services for crisis response. So these are programs such as Nasiha Hotline and Amala Hope Line, and I really hope that people do take advantage of being able to call and on the other end have a Muslim who's able to pick up and, in a moment of a pinch or a crisis response to help. And I hope between all of these resources that this is helpful for people to know. If folks here who are listening happen to be on social media, there's some really wonderful resources there at the handle of the lab, the Stanford Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab, if you look us up, and also the handle for Maristan, which we put out a lot of really strong evidence-based mental health research and findings based on the Muslim community, but fully integrated with the Islamic understanding. So I do hope all those resources will be helpful and useful.
Speaking here today with Dr. Rania Awad, who is a practicing psychiatrist as well as a clinical associate professor based at the Stanford University School of Medicine, as well as the commissioner of the study that we had discussed today. Dr. Rania, thank you so much for your valuable time with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for featuring this.
Back to the news studio.
Thank you, Saliha. Before moving on to our next analysis, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back after these messages.
Our fellow Americans.
Right now, the COVID-19 vaccines are available to millions of Americans.
And soon, they will be available to everyone.
The science is clear. These vaccines will protect you and those you love from this dangerous and deadly disease.
They could save your life.
So we urge you to get vaccinated when it's available to you.
That's the first step to ending the pandemic and moving our country forward. It's up to you.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. To discuss the developments related to COVID-19 and vaccines, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. Today we have Dr. Jerome Kim, who is Director General of the International Vaccine Institute. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Dr. Kim.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
South Korea has been doing very good, and it's still just 2,000 daily cases. But from South Korean standards, it's pretty high. It has never reached 2,000 cases per day before. So what is happening right and what went wrong?
It's a complicated question, but the government had done pretty well for over a year in the pandemic, using a combination of social distancing, masks, crowd avoidance, and they really felt that they could control how people interacted. And I think that over the summer, the plan was to gradually release several of those, to relax some of the controls, to allow people a little more freedom to start instituting policies around mask use. But events intervened. There is a new variant circulating in Korea, as there are in other places, and that new variant appears to be more transmissible. People took some of the relaxation as an indication that it was safe to do things that might have been considered dangerous. And this would have included things like, going to crowded bars and not following the appropriate protocols, or going to places where you sing. In Korea, they call them noraebang. Other places, they call them karaoke. And then other entertainment venues that were very crowded. And it just created a situation where spread of a more infectious variant of the coronavirus could happen more quickly.
Hey, you mentioned different new type of variant. We are hearing that from the beginning of this virus, a South Korean variant, and then it was British variant. Then came the Brazil, and then Indian variant, and then we changed naming scheme. Now it's Delta and things like that. Do you think that is pointing out to that theory of gain of, what is it called? The gain of function?
Gain of function. But, you don't have to use that term, which is a term that they've used for certain types of research, which could increase the ability of a virus to hop from an animal into a human. And that is work conducted in a laboratory. In this case, what we're seeing is the natural evolution of a virus exposed to human populations and human immune or protective responses. And what those responses do is they select out viruses that are naturally more fit, that are able to spread more readily, or that cause disease more significantly, or may be resistant to some of the things that we have to treat or prevent the virus. So viruses are now emerging that are a little more resistant to some of the monoclonal antibodies that we have for treatment, and that actually may be slightly more resistant to some of the vaccines we have. Although at this point, it looks like the variants we know about remain sensitive and the vaccines remain effective.
It is not a function of that theory, gain of function, but it is a natural process which happen all the time in viruses.
Yes, and in fact, that's a great point. We see shifts in the types of influenza viruses or flu viruses that circulate every year. In a virus that I'm very familiar with because I've worked on it for a long time, HIV, the ability of the virus to change itself is even greater than it is in the COVID-19 virus. In fact, I've made the point sometimes that if you look at all the sequence variation in COVID-19, you could fit that on the tip of my little finger. But if you looked at the variation in HIV in a single year in a single country, it would be the size of my hand. So, each virus has a slightly different speed with which it accumulates mutations. And coronaviruses in general are a bit slower than some of the other viruses that we call RNA viruses. Coronaviruses are RNA viruses. So we are seeing waves of successive, slightly different types of coronaviruses. So in the beginning, it was the original Wuhan strain. But then shortly thereafter, it was replaced by a variant that really kind of took over in Europe and actually elsewhere in the world. And then, we had what's called the Alpha variant, which is the UK variant, the Beta variant, which is South African, the Gamma variant, which is Brazilian, and then now the Delta variant, and now there's Delta Plus out of the Indian or South Asia region. But really now at this point, it's spreading all over the world. And I think that the thing that we have to remember is these variants are being generated in large, uncontrolled outbreaks. In order to mutate itself, the virus has to spread from person to person and essentially grow within a person who's been infected. So to the extent that we can socially distance as a first step, be vaccinated as a second step, then that allows countries to better control the virus, decreases the amount of spread in a population, and decreases the generation of mutants. So in a sense, doing all those things allows you to fight against the virus more effectively.
So, people who are vaccinated, do they need to still? I mean, there is some confusion. It was very clear a few months ago that everybody need to use mask in the United States. Now there seems to be a confusion. Not very far from my office in Chicago, there were 100,000 people in Grant Park on a music festival, and so do you think it is always a wiser idea to have masks on?
Yes. So the issue of masks is a little bit complicated, and it's even more complicated now because the Delta variant appears to be more transmissible. But the thinking was that a person who is vaccinated, although he or she may become infected, that they might be making less virus, that they might transmit the virus less well. With the Delta variant, it appears that if you've been vaccinated and you're infected, the amount of virus that's in your nose and throat is the same as an unvaccinated person who's infected. And that means that potentially the ability to spread that virus to others is similar to what's seen in an unvaccinated individual. What the vaccine does do, though, even though you could be infected, is that it appears to decrease severe disease, hospitalization, and death. So remember, with this COVID-19 virus, about 85% of people are mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic. Another maybe 10% of people, 15% of people get hospitalized. 5% of people need to go on ventilators, and about 2% of people die or succumb to the virus. And the vaccines change that so that far fewer people get admitted to the hospital, and many fewer die if they're vaccinated. So vaccination does protect you against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. It doesn't necessarily protect you against infection. So the reason to wear a mask is very similar to the reasons that we used before we had vaccines. You use a mask, there's some data that it protects you against infection. There's actually better data that it protects other people in case you get infected. So if you're infected and wearing a mask, you're not as able to spread the virus to other people. So the reason, again, despite vaccination, to use a mask, particularly with the Delta variant, is that we don't want to be, although it's the virus at this point, if we're vaccinated, isn't going to make us as sick, we still have the potential to spread it to others. The other part is, though many countries are nearly at 70%, between 60 and 70% in terms of people who've received at least one shot, there's still a significant number of people who haven't been vaccinated for whatever reason. And if you go to some communities or some states in the United States, the level of vaccination is much, much lower. So the virus is able to spread much more rapidly in those populations. So again, it would be one thing if everyone were vaccinated, but because everyone is not, there are still going to be places where transmission is going to be substantial. So get vaccinated, continue to wear a mask and distance where you can, because the messaging around masks gets really complicated. It's okay to do it if you're outside, but if you're inside and then you can't control distance, then you have to wear a mask. Those kinds of messages are difficult to translate in the real world. In Korea, for instance, if you were to walk on the street, or if you were to come to our office, everyone in the hallways wears a mask. Everyone on the street is wearing a mask. Yet we have 2,000 new cases a day in Korea. And why is that? It's because in the settings where transmission is occurring, the masks are off. They may be eating with friends, meeting with family. And in those settings, our guard is down, our masks are off, and we're able to transmit. So, masks work, distancing works, vaccination works. We need to start thinking about systematic approaches to prevention of COVID.
In the United States, Dr. Kim, where you have served honorably to our country, we are a divided nation. I mean, a health issue has become a partisan issue. And now schools are opening up. And there is a big fight on whether to mask children or not to mask them. couple of states in Texas and Florida actually have outlawed anyone asking children to have masks. And some places fight have broken out outside the school on this issue. Forgetting all the politics, what advice will you give to parents?
You know, and this gets to some of the issues that have developed not only in the United States, but in other countries where the coronavirus pandemic has been politicized. The fight should not be with other human beings. I mean, to get through this successfully, we're all going to need to work together. I mean, this isn't something that half the country can do and the other half ignores. This is a real public health threat. 4 million people around the world have died. Over 400,000 in the United States. Around the world, over 200 million people have been infected. This is something that we need to deal with as people, with other people. The enemy here is not, a Republican or a Democrat. The real cause of this pandemic is a virus for which we have vaccine solutions, and a virus for which we have other non-pharmacologic solutions that decrease transmission, and the combination of them will be very effective. But we need to do this together, and we can't individually do it and then assume that that's going to be enough. This is something where the national governments will have to take charge and protect people against infection by the COVID-19 virus. I mean, it sounds simple. It's in the real world, it's very complicated. But if you want the country to do well, if we want fewer people to become infected, if we want fewer people to die, if we want fewer people in hospitals so that hospitals can do the real work of taking care of people with all conditions, then we're going to need to participate together in solutions that will allow us to decrease transmission, infection, and death.
While United States and many developed countries, those who are willing to take vaccine, they have vaccines available. Politics is stopping some others. But there are countries around the world who cannot afford to purchase, or they're not enough for them to purchase. Do you think that the South Korean vaccine, which is coming up, which has been given green light on Tuesday to enter in phase 3. Do you think South Korea has good hope that it will be as good as 94-95% in tackling the virus?
Yeah, so, and IBI is participating in the testing of this vaccine. We think that the levels of protection that are seen with this vaccine should be comparable to other safe and efficacious vaccines, but I don't know the number yet. And one of the reasons to be a little bit careful is, remember that the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine were tested in phase 3 trials when we didn't have some of the mutants we have now. So we can't necessarily compare a vaccine trial done in late 2021 to a vaccine trial that was done in mid 2020, because the circulating virus strains are different. But at least from the level of protection that we see, we would predict beforehand that the vaccine that the South Korean company has should be safe and efficacious. That's on the one side. But the other part of this is, we need a tremendous amount of vaccine. If you think that there are about 8 billion people on the planet Earth, and each person needs 2 shots, that's 16 billion doses of vaccine. When we think about how much vaccine is normally made, and we pick influenza vaccine, flu vaccine, it's one of the most commonly used vaccines. We make between 400 and 500 million doses a year, and this is maybe 24 companies around the world. We have already given 4 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines. And with that 4 billion doses, we vaccinated 25% of the world's population. So individual companies are going to be important. They need to make as much as they can of safe and efficacious vaccines. And in fact, this company, SK Bioscience, is also making AstraZeneca and Novavax vaccine. But we need the companies that can make high quality vaccine in significant quantities to step up to the plate and manufacture as much COVID-19 vaccine as possible, and to begin testing quickly of vaccines that may work better against some of the mutant viruses.
Dr. Kim, you're such an excellent communicator. This position as Director General of International Vaccine Institute, is it going to give you a better platform to communicate to general audience along with the specialized audience?
You know, IVI is a pretty small international organization, and we're based in Seoul in South Korea. And you know, the pandemic has not had the same impact in South Korea as it has in other parts of the world. You know, I think many people at IVI, at other organizations throughout Asia and Europe and North America have been speaking very effectively about the importance of vaccination and social distancing and masks. And, you know, those advocates are important. And many people get good information from these sources. But at the same time, there needs to be a whole of government effort in order to get people out and get them vaccinated. Make it easy for people to get vaccines. Make it socially acceptable. Make people want to be vaccinated. Lower the barriers to vaccination. Get out there to communities that have low uptake of vaccination. And there are quite a few around the world, but also in the United States, of communities where the penetration of vaccines is suboptimal. There are states in the United States where the penetration of vaccines is suboptimal. But we really need to get out there with the correct messages and teach people and talk to them and not lecture them and wag our finger and say, you know, you're doing all these bad things. And the goal here is to beat this virus. And the way we do it is to work together, the way we've done so many other things in the world and in countries around the world. We really need to pull together and make a united front against the pandemic.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kim, once again for being with us at Muslim Network TV. Thank you.
Thank you.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid and Dr. Kim. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.